My ex-wife cheated, abandoned our kids, and ran off with another man. Years later, she shows up with his son, begging to be a family again. I met my ex-wife, Holly, when we were both in our mid-20s. I was about 24 at the time, and we worked at the same firm, which is how we got to know each other. After dating for 2 years, we decided to get married, and within 3 years, we had 2 daughters who are now 9 and 7 years old. Our second child wasn't planned, and Holly wasn't thrilled about the pregnancy. I had reassured her that if she didn't want to go through with it, I would understand and support whatever decision she made. But she chose to continue with the pregnancy. After our first daughter was born, things between us were still great. We were as in love as ever. But something changed after the second pregnancy. Holly became increasingly moody, irritable, and short-tempered. She would lash out at me or our eldest daughter over the smallest things. At first, I chalked it up to hormones and figured it was just a rough patch we'd have to work through. I tried my best to accept this new version of her, hoping it would pass with time. But instead of improving, things only got worse. Eventually, my daughter and I found ourselves tiptoeing around her, trying not to set her off. Even though Holly had chosen to be a stay-at-home mom after our first child was born, leaving her job on her own accord, I ended up taking on nearly all the household responsibilities. Initially, she did manage the housework and cared for our eldest while I worked, but when she got pregnant again, things changed. She claimed she was too exhausted to keep up with the chores and looking after our daughter, so we hired a housekeeper to help out. It was more than we could comfortably afford at the time, but I went along with it because I didn't want to put any unnecessary strain on her, especially during pregnancy. I assumed that once she had given birth and recovered, she would return to taking care of the house and the kids during the day. But months passed, and that never happened. Instead, she remained just as irritable and withdrawn, refusing to do any housework at all. Most of her days were spent in front of the TV, not even engaging with the kids. She wouldn't take them out to play, and when she did, it was only because she paid our neighbor to take them to the park. I don't want to sound bitter, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel some resentment. I was working tirelessly to provide for our family, and yet she wouldn't even put in the bare minimum effort at home. Keeping a full-time housekeeper was becoming financially unsustainable, especially since I was already struggling to cover all our other expenses. I also wanted to save for our daughter's future, but that was nearly impossible with Holly refusing to contribute in any way. About 6 months after our younger daughter was born, I realized we couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. I knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, so I asked my parents to take the kids for the day, and they agreed. When Holly and I finally sat down, I told her that I understood she was exhausted after 2 pregnancies, but I needed her to meet me halfway. I explained that we simply couldn't afford a full-time housekeeper anymore, and I needed her to start helping out again, at least with some of the household chores, so we could cut back on costs. She shot the idea down immediately. Without missing a beat, she told me no, claiming that she was already too busy taking care of the kids to do any housework. Then she turned it around on me, saying I should be earning more instead of making excuses and blaming her for our financial problems. I tried to reason with her, explaining that I was already working as hard as I could, but that marriage was a partnership, and we both needed to pull our weight. I also pointed out that she wasn't actually taking care of the kids the way she claimed. As far as I knew, they just sat with her for hours while she watched trashy reality shows. The housekeeper had even mentioned this to me in passing. But bringing that up turned out to be a huge mistake. Holly immediately flew into a rage, accusing me of spying on her through the housekeeper. What started as a discussion quickly spiraled into a full-blown argument. She went off on a tirade about how she was tired of being pushed around and forced to do all the work, though, ironically, she wasn't doing any of it in the first place. She then shifted the blame to me, saying it was my fault we couldn't afford a housekeeper and that it was pathetic that I had to beg her for help when I was supposed to be the man of the house. None of it made any sense. She was grasping at straws, twisting the situation to make it seem like I was the problem while completely ignoring the reality of her own behavior. The fight escalated from there. At one point, she called me a loser who wasn't good enough for a woman like her. I snapped back, calling her a lazy cow and telling her she had already failed as a mother, given how terrified our eldest daughter was of her. And now, she was failing as a wife too. That was the breaking point. My words clearly hit a nerve, and in response, she shoved me hard. I lost my balance and fell backward, crashing into the coffee table. The glass shattered beneath me, and I hit the ground so badly that I had to be rushed to the ER. The whole time, Holly kept apologizing and crying, but I was done. Thankfully, my injuries were only surface level, just some bruising on my back, but I realized I couldn't trust her anymore. If she could lose control like that with me, what was stopping her from doing the same to our kids? I told her she had to move out. I wasn't willing to take that risk. There was no telling when she might snap again, and I wasn't going to wait for that to happen. I had my parents keep our daughters until Holly was gone, and for the next week, she kept pleading with me, swearing it would never happen again. But it didn't matter anymore. I didn't believe her. I couldn't. I almost went through with filing for divorce right away, but Holly begged me to give her another chance. By the end of that first week, we reached an agreement. She would move in with her parents for a while and start therapy. The only condition was that she wouldn't be allowed to return home until a medical professional gave her a clean bill of health. Clearly, something was very wrong. People don't just act that way if they're happy. But she was willing to get help, and I wanted to believe she could get better. More than anything, I didn't want my daughters to grow up without their mother, so I agreed to hold off on the divorce and give our marriage one more shot. While living separately, we also started marriage counseling. For a time, it seemed like things were improving. My parents had moved in with me to help with the girls, and Holly was still staying with her parents. We attended counseling together every week, and I was in touch with her therapist, who diagnosed her with postpartum depression. According to the therapist, one of her symptoms was uncontrollable anger, which explained the drastic shift in her personality. She hadn't been this way before, but the condition had spiraled out of control. Shoving me was the breaking point that forced us both to acknowledge the severity of the situation. This went on for nearly a year. About 6 months in, I even allowed her supervised visits with our daughters. Slowly but surely, she started resembling the woman I had fallen in love with. I had real hope that we were on the right track, that we could rebuild what was broken. But then, without warning, she started skipping counseling sessions. At first, she didn't offer any real explanation, just vague excuses. Then she began avoiding me entirely. She stopped responding to my calls and messages, but her therapist assured me she was still making progress. None of it made sense. I kept trying to reach her, but every time I did, she would dismiss me, saying she just needed some space. After nearly 3 months of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go to her parents' house in person. I hadn't done so earlier because her parents had made it very clear that they blamed me for everything. In their eyes, I was the reason their daughter had gone crazy, and they believed I had pushed her into acting out. Holly had even warned me that visiting her would only cause unnecessary drama, and that was the last thing we needed. But after months of her avoiding me, I didn't care about drama anymore. I just needed answers. When I arrived at her parents' house, I expected to find her there. Instead, they greeted me with cold stares and immediately shut me down. When I asked where she was, they flat out refused to tell me. Then, without another word, they slammed the door in my face. Something felt off. I could tell they were enjoying this, which made my stomach sink. I had a terrible feeling, the kind that gnaws at you and won't let go. So I called Holly. Over and over again. She ignored every single call. My paranoia was getting worse by the second, so I decided to check around the house myself. I knew that her parents usually kept the kitchen door unlocked, so I made my way to the backyard. But before I even got that far, I saw her. She was sitting on the swing in her parents' backyard. But she wasn't alone. She was making out with some guy I didn't recognize. It's been years since that moment, but it's burned into my brain like a scar that won't fade. I can still see it clearly, the way they were wrapped up in each other, completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing right there. The guy was the first to notice me. He immediately pulled away, but by the time Holly turned around, I had already started walking back to my car. She ran after me, calling my name, trying to stop me, but I didn't hear a word she said. My ears were ringing. My mind had shut down. I was in shock. She tried to grab my arm, but I yanked it away and told her not to touch me. And she didn't. I got in my car, drove straight home, and blocked her on every possible platform before she had the chance to explain herself. The moment I walked through the door, I told my parents everything and asked them to find me a lawyer. I wasn't going to waste another second on her. I didn't see or hear from Holly again until we had to meet with the court-appointed mediator for our divorce settlement. By that point, I had turned into a shell of myself, functioning on autopilot for the sake of my daughters but completely emotionally shut down. Not even the news that Holly was giving up her parental rights made me feel anything. She had made up her mind, she wanted to be with the man I had caught her with. Let's call him Calvin. Apparently, he was her childhood friend. They had drifted apart after high school, but when she moved back in with her parents, they reconnected. She claimed she had fallen in love with him, and her parents were fully on board. Looking back, it made sense why they had been so smug when they slammed the door in my face. They had been rooting for this all along. They had always wanted her to end up with Calvin. In their eyes, Holly was finally choosing herself and her own happiness. As if she had ever done anything else. The divorce process dragged on, mostly because Holly, despite being the one who cheated, still expected to qualify for alimony. My lawyer and I fought hard, making sure she walked away with nothing. It took time, but in the end, justice was served. It's been 5 years since the divorce was finalized, and I still feel relieved knowing she didn't get a dime from me. But those months, the ones where I was trapped in the middle of it all, dealing with the betrayal, the legal battle, and the heartbreak, those were some of the hardest days of my life. Even in the hardest moments, I knew I couldn't break. My daughters had no one but me to rely on, and I wasn't going to let them down. My parents were an incredible source of support, and I'll always be grateful for how they stood by me while I juggled work and parenting. It's been 5 years since then. At the time, the divorce felt like the worst thing that could possibly happen, but looking back now, I realize it was a blessing in disguise. If I had stayed with Holly, I don't think I would have ever reached the place I'm in today. Life has been good to me since I made the decision to leave her, and I'm in a much better position mentally, emotionally, and financially. We've moved into a bigger home, thanks to my improved income, and I no longer have to support anyone but myself and my daughters. My parents live nearby and visit often, and I have friends who genuinely care about me. Most importantly, my daughters are happy, and at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. For the first time in a long time, I was content. Everything was finally going right. At least, that was the case until a few days ago when Holly showed up at my doorstep. The kids were at school, and I was just about to head out for work when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened the door without thinking much of it. And there she was. Holly stood in front of me, and beside her was a little boy who couldn't have been older than 3 or 4. It didn't take long for me to realize that he had to be her son. I was still trying to wrap my head around the sight of her standing there after all these years when, out of nowhere, she started crying. She said she was here to apologize, that she wanted to make things right. Then she told me, without an ounce of hesitation, that she was finally ready to be a family again and give our marriage another shot. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After all these years, after everything she had done, she really thought it was up to her? That she could just show up one day and declare that we were a family again, as if she hadn't thrown it all away herself? The decision was instant. I didn't need time to think. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that this was not her family anymore. She lost that right the day she cheated on me with Calvin. The divorce was nothing more than a legal formality. Our marriage had ended the moment she made that choice. And as for our daughters? She had willingly given up custody. That had been her own decision. She had no claim on us now, and she never would again. With that, I shut the door in her face. I didn't want her anywhere near my home, near my daughters, or near the life I had built without her. The only reason I didn't curse her out was because of the little boy standing next to her. He was innocent in all this. Even after the door was closed, I could hear her crying outside. She stayed there for a few minutes, sobbing, but I didn't acknowledge it. I waited until I was sure she was gone, then left for work, determined to push the whole thing out of my mind. I almost succeeded in forgetting she had ever shown up. But as soon as I got home that evening, I received a call from my parents, and they were furious. They demanded to know why I had turned Holly away. It turns out she had run straight to them after I shut the door on her, telling them how devastated she was. My parents then admitted that they were the ones who had given her my new address in the first place. They had encouraged her to come find me, believing that since she was in the process of divorcing Calvin, she finally had a chance to make things right. Apparently, this had been in the works for a while. Holly had reached out to them about a month ago, and instead of telling me, they took it upon themselves to decide for me that she deserved another chance. They told me it was time I started thinking about my kids, that my daughters needed their mother, and there was no better person for the job than Holly. I was furious. It was not their place to forgive her. It was not their decision to make. They had absolutely no right to interfere in my life like this, especially without even consulting me first. What if my daughters had been home when she showed up? Did they even consider the kind of damage that could have caused? Their actions were reckless, and I let them know exactly how I felt about it. But they refused to see their mistake. Instead, they threw it back in my face, saying that because they had helped me during the divorce, taking care of the kids and supporting me, I didn't have the right to shut them out of the decision-making process now. They genuinely believed they had an equal say in what was best for my daughters and that I had no right to take that away from them. I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard. At the end of the day, these were my children, not theirs. No matter how much I respected them or appreciated everything they had done for me, that didn't give them the right to invite Holly back into my life. Our argument escalated. They accused me of being selfish, of being too stubborn and arrogant to see that my daughters needed their mother. They insisted that Holly had changed, that they had done their research, and they were confident she deserved another chance. Even when I reminded them that she had legally signed away her parental rights, they refused to back down. They acted as if I was insulting them by suggesting they would ever put me or my daughters in harm's way. It's been a few days now, and I still don't think I was out of line. I've thought about it a lot, and no matter how I look at it, I can't see how refusing to let Holly back in makes me the bad guy. But then I found out the real truth. A week after Holly showed up at my door, I learned something so disturbing that I still can't fully wrap my head around it. Not only had my parents given her my address, but they had never actually cut contact with her in the first place. For the past 5 years, while I had erased her from my life, they had been keeping in touch. They had believed all along that she would come around one day, that she would wake up and want her family back. They didn't talk to her often, maybe once a month, but that was enough. Enough for me to feel completely betrayed. And the worst part? They never once told me. As it turns out, Calvin had played a major role in Holly signing away her parental rights. When she was served with the divorce papers, he gave her an ultimatum: she could either abandon her family and start a new life with him, or she could fight for custody and stay in her daughters' lives, but that would mean leaving him behind. According to my parents, it had been a difficult decision for her. But in the end, she chose to be with Calvin, turning her back on the family she already had. After I filed for divorce, Holly contacted my parents, telling them about her situation and begging them for help. She still wanted to see her kids but claimed she had been backed into a corner by both me and Calvin. On one side, I was fighting for full custody with supervised visitation, and on the other, Calvin was demanding she cut ties with her children altogether. Even if she had fought for custody, her chances of winning were slim, considering the circumstances of our divorce and her history of uncontrollable anger. It was a risk she wasn't willing to take. If she lost, she wouldn't just lose her daughters, she'd lose Calvin too. That's when my parents stepped in. She met with them privately and practically begged them to help her stay in touch with the kids. She knew that once she legally gave up her rights, she wouldn't even have supervised visitation. But my parents would. And they planned on exploiting that. And they did. For years, they went behind my back, allowing Holly to secretly need our daughters. They justified their actions by telling themselves that no child should be kept away from their mother. Apparently, betraying their own son didn't weigh on their conscience nearly as much. Every time I dropped my daughters off at my parents' house, they would invite Holly over, letting her spend time with them. My kids never told me because my parents bribed them with toys, candy, and whatever else it took to keep them quiet. Whenever I asked my daughters about their day, they'd tell me they played games with Grandma and Grandpa's friend. I never thought much of it, I just assumed they were talking about my parents' actual friends. But no. That's what my parents had told them to call Holly, just in case I ever asked. When I found out, I was stunned. My own daughters had been lying to me. But I forgave them immediately. They were just kids. Holly and my parents had manipulated and intimidated them into keeping quiet. When I finally confronted my daughters and asked if they had been secretly seeing their mother, they broke down crying. They told me they hadn't said anything because they were afraid Holly and my parents had told them that if they revealed the truth, God would punish them. That hit me hard. They had drilled so much fear into my daughters that they truly believed there would be dire consequences if they told me the truth. And I hated myself for never questioning who this so-called friend was. Because, in all honesty, it could have been anyone, someone far worse than Holly, and I never would have known. But I'm putting an end to it now. I've already spoken to my lawyer, and the restraining order has been filed against all of them. I have written proof, too. My parents, in their infinite wisdom, decided to send me an email a few days after our fight, explaining their reasoning. They thought the email would make me see how desperate Holly was to remain a mother without losing her so-called soulmate. All it did was prove to me that everyone involved was a liar. Holly gave up her rights for Calvin. She signed away her place in her daughters' lives just to keep a man who, in the end, left her anyway. It's almost poetic. Calvin, the man she threw everything away for, ended up abandoning her, too. According to my parents, Holly and Calvin had a son together. But now, Calvin wanted nothing to do with either of them. He had accepted a job in another city and was moving away in a couple of months. Holly, having recently gone back to work, didn't want to uproot her son since he had just started kindergarten. That led to constant fights, and 3 months ago, Calvin finally told her he was done. He was leaving. He wasn't interested in being a family man anymore because, in his words, sacrificing his future and happiness just to make her happy wasn't worth it. My parents thought all of this would make me feel sorry for Holly. It didn't. It just felt like justice. Update 1. Hey everyone, I just wanted to say thank you for all the support and kind messages. It really means a lot to me and my daughters. Holly, my parents, and everyone involved have been served with restraining orders. They're supposed to appear in court in a few days. I have no idea how they feel about it, because I've blocked them on every platform and told my friends to cut off contact in case they try to get to me through them. I've also increased security around my house and have been working from home for a few days just to be safe. I spoke to my daughter's school and explained the situation. I even considered keeping them home for a while, but I didn't want their education to suffer because of Holly's mess. The school has agreed to keep an eye on them, and no one except me is allowed to pick them up. I'm doing everything in my power to make sure Holly and my parents can't get to us, because I know they'll try. So far, so good. And hopefully, once we get that restraining order finalized, they'll stay away for good. Update 2. Just a quick update, I got the restraining order. For the next 5 years, Holly and my parents legally have to stay away from me and my daughters. If they try to contact us, there will be serious consequences. I'm still keeping all the security measures in place for now. The last time I saw them, they looked pissed, and I don't want to take any chances. As for my daughters, we've started attending family therapy. I know this has been hard on them, and it probably has been for years without me even realizing it. But I'm doing everything I can to make sure they heal from this. We're making progress. And at the end of the day, all I want is for my daughters to be happy. That's all that matters to me. So please, keep sending us your best wishes. We could use them.